Every dish you have ever eaten, every meal you have ever cooked, every plate you have ever been served at a restaurant, all of it comes down to about 10 fundamental methods of applying heat to food. Some of these methods are older than civilization itself. Others were invented within living memory. But together, they explain why a roasted chicken tastes nothing like a boiled one, why a grilled steak hits differently than a braised one, and why a deep-fried potato and a steamed potato barely seem like the same vegetable. Boiling. It is the most universal cooking method on Earth, and humans were doing it long before anyone had invented a pot. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans heated stones in open fires, then dropped those scorching rocks directly into water held inside animal hides, hollowed logs, or bark-lined pits dug into the ground. The stones transferred their heat to the water, and eventually the water got hot enough to cook whatever was sitting in it. Actual clay pottery only appeared around 12,000 years ago, which means stone boiling had been feeding people for thousands of years before the first pot was ever shaped. The science of boiling is worth understanding because it explains a lot about everyday cooking. Water at sea level caps at 100 degrees Celsius. Once it reaches that point, adding more heat does not make the water hotter, it just makes it evaporate faster. That temperature ceiling is what makes boiling naturally forgiving. You cannot accidentally overshoot it, but altitude changes everything. In Denver, sitting roughly a mile above sea level, water boils at around 95 degrees. In La Paz, Bolivia, it boils closer to 87. That lower temperature means food cooks slower, pasta takes longer, beans take longer, and recipes written at sea level quietly stop working the way they should. And then, there is the question that starts more kitchen arguments than almost anything else. Does salting the water make it boil faster? No. Salt raises the boiling point slightly, but the amount you add to a pot of pasta water changes the temperature by less than 1 degree, so it makes no real difference. The reason you salt the water is flavor. Pasta absorbs water as it cooks, and if that water is seasoned, the pasta tastes better from the inside out. Boiling relies on water touching the food directly, but the oldest cooking method on Earth skipped the water entirely. Roasting. Long before any human figured out how to heat water, they were holding raw meat over open flame. Evidence of deliberately controlled fire dates back well over 1 million years, and those early fires were almost certainly used for roasting. It remains the most intuitive cooking method that exists. Heat rises from below or surrounds from all sides, and the surface of the food transforms. That transformation has a name. The Maillard reaction is a chemical process that occurs when proteins and sugars on the surface of food are exposed to dry heat above roughly 130 degrees Celsius. It produces hundreds of new flavor and aroma compounds that did not exist in the raw ingredient. This is why roasted chicken skin, roasted garlic, and the browned crust on a loaf of bread taste nothing like their uncooked versions. The reaction does not happen in the presence of water, which is the real reason boiled chicken and roasted chicken taste like two entirely different foods. One thing worth clearing up. Roasting and baking are technically identical. Both use dry, ambient heat inside an enclosed space. The difference is purely language. We say bake when it is bread or pastry, and roast when it is meat or vegetables. The oven does not know the difference. Temperature, though, changes everything about how roasting works. A chicken roasted at 220 degrees develops a deep golden, crackling skin while the juices barely have time to escape. Drop that temperature to 150 and the skin stays pale, the meat dries out, and the result is forgettable. Roasting surrounds food with hot air, but grilling does something more direct. Grilling. When food sits directly above or below an intense heat source with nothing between them, that is grilling. The heat is radiant, meaning it travels in a straight line from the source to the surface of the food, and the temperatures involved are far higher than any oven. A standard charcoal grill easily exceeds 300 degrees Celsius at the grate. The practice is ancient, and nearly every culture has developed its own version. In Argentina, asado is not just a method of cooking, it is a social institution. Whole animals or large beef cuts cook slowly over wood embers for hours, managed by a dedicated asador who controls the fire all afternoon. In Japan, yakitori stalls grill skewered chicken over white-hot binchotan charcoal. which burns at extreme temperatures with almost no smoke and produces a clean, intense heat. Korean barbecue puts a grill directly into the center of the dining table and lets everyone cook their own thin slices of marinated meat in real time. The char marks left by the grate are not just cosmetic. Where the metal contacts the surface, temperatures spike, creating concentrated lines of Maillard browning that taste more intense than the surrounding area. That contrast is a big part of why grilled food tastes different from food cooked on a flat surface. Grilling uses no added fat at all, but the next method depends on it entirely: sautéing. The word comes from the French verb sauter, meaning to jump, and it describes exactly what happens when small pieces of food hit a very hot pan with a thin layer of oil or butter. The food bounces, hisses, and moves constantly, either tossed by flicking the wrist or stirred with a spatula. The key to a good sauté is heat. The pan has to be hot enough that food sizzles the instant it makes contact. If the pan is too cool, moisture leaks out instead of evaporating, and the food steams in its own liquid rather than browning. That is the difference between golden caramelized onions and pale, limp ones sitting in a puddle. French cuisine is essentially built on the sauté. Nearly every classic French sauce, soup, and braise begins with sautéing aromatics in butter. The method traveled into professional kitchens worldwide, and its close relative, stir-frying, follows the same principle but uses a round-bottomed wok over extremely high flame. Chinese cooks call the elusive smoky flavor it produces wok hei, which translates roughly to the breath of the wok. It comes from oil vaporizing and briefly igniting as food is tossed through open flame, and it disappears within seconds of the food leaving the pan. A sauté uses a thin film of fat, but the next method takes that idea to an extreme: deep frying. In deep frying, food is fully submerged in oil, heated to roughly 170 to 190 degrees Celsius. The moment food enters the oil, moisture at the surface flashes into steam, creating the violent bubbling you see in a fryer. As the water escapes, the surface dehydrates and turns crispy, while the inside steams gently from residual moisture trapped beneath the crust. That is why fried food is crunchy on the outside and soft on the inside. Two different processes happening at the same time. If the oil is not hot enough, the crust forms too slowly, and the food absorbs fat like a sponge. If the oil is too hot, the outside burns before the inside cooks through. That narrow temperature window is the reason every professional fryer has a thermostat. Ancient Egyptians were among the earliest cultures known to have fried food in rendered animal fat. But the most refined frying tradition came about almost by accident. In the 16th century, Portuguese missionaries in Japan introduced battering and frying seafood. Japanese cooks stripped the batter to a lighter consistency and created tempura. The batter is deliberately mixed with ice-cold water and barely stirred, leaving lumps of dry flour. Those lumps create an uneven surface when fried, producing the light, shatteringly crispy texture that tempura is known for. Deep frying submerges food in hot fat, but the next method cooks food without touching any liquid at all: steaming. In steaming, food sits above boiling water and cooks entirely in the vapor rising from the surface. The food never contacts the liquid directly, making steaming one of the gentlest methods available. Chinese bamboo steamers have been in use for thousands of years. Round baskets with slatted bottoms stack over a pot or wok of boiling water. Steam rises through the gaps, cooks the food in each tier, and exits through the woven lid, which absorbs excess moisture and prevents condensation from dripping back down. This is why dim sum restaurants can prepare dozens of dishes at the same time using a single heat source. Because the food never sits in water, steaming preserves more water-soluble vitamins than boiling. Broccoli steamed instead of boiled retains significantly more vitamin C. The texture stays firmer too. Steamed fish holds together in a way that boiled fish simply cannot, which is why Cantonese cuisine considers a whole steamed fish with ginger and scallion one of its defining dishes. And steaming shows up in more places than people realize. Moroccan couscous is traditionally steamed above a simmering stew. Mexican tamales are wrapped in corn husks and steamed until the masa sets. Indian idli, the soft, spongy rice cakes eaten at breakfast across southern India, are steamed in special molds and could not exist without the method. Steaming keeps food above the liquid, but the next method asks you to sink it halfway in. Braising. Braising is a combination technique. You start by searing food in a hot pan to build a browned crust. Then you add liquid, cover the pot, reduce the heat, and let everything cook slowly for hours. It is a method that turns patience into flavor. The reason braising works so well on tough, inexpensive cuts of meat is collagen. Cuts like beef chuck, pork shoulder, and lamb shank are full of connective tissue that makes them chewy and unpleasant when cooked quickly. But when held at a low temperature in liquid for hours, the collagen slowly dissolves into gelatin. That gelatin gives the braising liquid a rich, silky body, without anyone adding flour or starch, and the meat turns fork tender. The liquid matters too. Wine, beer, stock, or even water all produce different results, and the braising liquid concentrates as it reduces, building flavor the entire time. Some of the most celebrated dishes in European cooking are braises born from necessity. Coq au vin was originally a French farmhouse solution for cooking a tough old rooster that would have been terrible roasted. The Italian peposo, a Tuscan beef stew loaded with black pepper, was supposedly created by kiln workers who slow-cooked their meat overnight in the residual heat of brick kilns because they had no proper kitchen. In every case, the method transformed something cheap into something people now pay serious money for. Braising breaks food down over hours, but the next method adds something else entirely. Flavor from wood, smoking. Before refrigeration existed, smoking was one of the only reliable ways to preserve meat and fish for long periods. The smoke deposits a thin layer of antimicrobial compounds onto the surface of the food, slowing bacterial growth and extending shelf life. But the reason smoking survived long after refrigeration made it unnecessary is straightforward. It tastes incredible. There are two categories. Hot smoking cooks the food while it smokes, typically between 70 and 120 degrees Celsius. This is how most barbecue is made. Cold smoking only adds flavor without cooking, usually below 30 degrees, and is used for smoked salmon, certain cheeses, and cured meats. The type of wood matters enormously. Hickory gives a strong, bacon-like smokiness. Applewood produces something milder and slightly sweet. Mesquite burns hot and creates a sharp, aggressive smoke that easily overpowers food if left too long. American barbecue culture has turned wood selection into an art form, with pitmasters in Texas, the Carolinas, and Kansas City, each using different woods and techniques to get entirely different results from the same cuts of meat. And if you have ever sliced into a piece of barbecued brisket and noticed a bright pink ring just beneath the dark surface, that is the smoke ring. It forms when nitrogen dioxide in the smoke reacts with the myoglobin in the meat, and pitmasters treat it as a badge of honor. Smoking adds flavor through wood and thyme, but the next method is almost the opposite. Slow, gentle, and deliberately quiet. Poaching. In poaching, food cooks in liquid held just below the boiling point, usually between 70 and 82 degrees Celsius. No bubbles break the surface. The water barely shimmers, and that gentleness is the entire point. Poaching is the go-to method for anything delicate. Fish fillets that would fall apart on a grill hold their shape in a poaching liquid. Chicken breasts that turn dry and stringy when roasted come out moist and tender when poached correctly. French chefs developed court bouillon, a poaching liquid seasoned with white wine, peppercorns, bay leaves, and aromatics, specifically to infuse delicate fish with flavor while it cooked. It is a technique that adds taste to food through the liquid itself, rather than relying on browning or fat. The technique extends into desserts, too. Pears poached in red wine with cinnamon and star anise are a classic French dish where the fruit absorbs the color and flavor of the wine, turning deep burgundy all the way through. And the most famous poached food in the world is almost certainly the egg. Eggs Benedict exists because poaching is the only method gentle enough to set the white into a soft shape, while leaving the yolk completely liquid inside. Poaching relies on instinct and a careful eye, but the final method on this list removes instinct from the equation entirely. Sous-vide. The name is French for under vacuum, and the technique works exactly as it sounds. Food is sealed inside a plastic bag with the air removed, then placed in water held at a precise, constant temperature by a circulating heater. The food cooks evenly from edge to edge, and because the water never exceeds the target temperature, it is essentially impossible to overcook. The method was developed in France in the 1970s by chef Georges Prelus, who was trying to prevent foie gras from losing its fat during traditional cooking. Sealing it in a vacuum bag and cooking it in precisely controlled water produced dramatically better results, with almost no fat loss and a perfectly even texture throughout. For decades, sous-vide stayed in restaurants because the equipment was expensive. That changed when affordable immersion circulators reached the home market, and everyday cooks discovered they could produce restaurant-quality steaks with almost no effort. A steak cooked at exactly 54 degrees Celsius comes out medium rare from edge to edge, with no gray band of overcooked meat near the surface. A quick sear in a hot cast iron skillet afterward adds the crust. Eggs might be the best example of how precise the method really is. At 60 degrees, the white is barely set, and the yolk is warm and runny. At 63, the white firms up, but the yolk stays creamy. At 68, the yolk begins to set. Each single degree produces a noticeably different egg, and no other cooking method gives you that kind of control. 10 methods, some older than civilization, some barely a generation old, and every meal you have ever eaten used at least one of them. If you found this useful, subscribe. There is a lot more coming.